Hmm. All right. Well, we might have considered Arthur Rimbaud um, as always, whether even before you have heard of him, um, when the name comes up, it might often be in something that you've read in reference to something else, to some other theme. At least that's how it was for me. And then at some point, at a certain vulnerable time in my life, when my literary taste, as it was evolving, would be open to this very kind of character, that's when I heard of Arthur Rimbaud by name. And then I began to hear all at once, it seemed like, he embodied immediately a fascination and a legend. First of all, he was about he was about the age I was when it first appeared to me as a character. When he first appeared to me as a character, he was about the same age I was when he was writing these explosive works of almost like graphic comic book like intellectual intensity, which was able to make itself known to my imagination in a way that nothing else had before, so that I could describe it the way I'm describing it now. That was not possible, for me to even say that until the circumstances for me to understand Rimbaud were Rimbaud himself as a character, as a literary character who was a poet who wrote incandescently. And then this is part of the legend in the form in which it is easily handed down. Immediately, at the age of by the time he's 20 or 21, he has abandoned utterly poetry and never writes again. Instead, goes to Africa and becomes a gun runner. Basically, that's the shorthand that you hear it and that you might repeat to yourself when you're a teenager, and are telling someone else, which you may not be doing. Right? Maybe you're keeping that to yourself because it's something that you're reading about. But sometimes you might talk about it with your friends because you know also that many could identify with this kind of figure. It's a communal figure, actually, especially at the same time. Rimbaud appears in the self-mythologizing mystique around more than one rock and roll poet artist. Bob Dylan and Jim Morrison and Patti Smith. All of them remind us in some way of the mystique of Dylan and are in turn inspired by, and it becomes part of their mystique because they themselves are inspired by the mystique of Rimbaud in their own presentation of their artistic self, before they're public. And then we, the audience, find nourishment for our souls in our own unique archetypal imaginations, so that some figures make it known to us that understanding is available to us that we can develop in ourselves in unique ways. And so as a teacher of poetry, then, the character of Rimbaud is very, very inspiring. But the myth is what reaches you first, as I'm saying, the abandonment of poetry, the one who had this, mystique of running away at a young age after having achieved the ultimate. That's how it could be taken, and that's the level that it first makes its appeal, in the volatility of its apparitional energy, which as it moves through time and space like an art form, which it is, this mystique of Arthur Rimbaud. But then there's, as always, because it is so fascinating, there's more to it, and then new open doorways and vistas kind of happen by. And then you begin to realize, one dwells and abides with this long enough, one develops one's own relationship to it. This is the character and mystique of Rimbaud, yeah. And so this is how it was built up over time, you see, and this is how it came to me. Anyway, so Rimbaud as a teacher, then, and I can say to you that all of his intentions and the entire design of his life is actually of one whole with the course of his work and with the course of his compositions, you see. And so to start off with then, we'll explore a well-known document of Rimbaud from which an incandescent interpretation has been drawn about the notion of the poet as a seer. The poet becomes a seer by the long and systematic derangement of all the senses. All forms of love, of suffering, of madness are exhausted, and those go away, and he keeps within himself only the essence of himself and only the quintessences. And so this also appeals in a certain sense to a certain developmental stage in the psyche, because at adolescence one understands that this, what I'm experiencing, is experience. And I can begin to understand it in a certain kind of abstract way, and yet I'm connected to it on an instinctual or emotional level, so that I can understand myself in a different dimension. Which brings us to Rimbaud and his doctrine, if you want to call it that, his exhortation, his notion, his conception of himself. His first conception of himself as a literary character is as a poet, which is, he originally to himself, defines as a seer. And this is the first time this is his announcement of himself long before he becomes anything else, long before he realizes in the same letter that he is another. For that's another level of the philosophical appeal of Rimbaud, his notion when he says to himself, of himself and by himself, that I is another. You see, and it's all here in this letter by Rimbaud. Before I explore it more specifically, though, I know this is a story about Rimbaud, but it's also a story about the type of poetic and literary character that Rimbaud is. And ultimately, it's a story about the poet approaching language as a medium through which the beyond can be seen. When Rimbaud makes it possible to speak of this kind of feeling in terms of literary history. So, and this is so, it's such a gift to us. Anyway, so we reach beyond, and finally becomes, how do we approach the notion of ultimate being? The notion of art as being at the foundation and the origin of beauty through the understanding of the energy-filled and mysterious origins of language itself, and being utterer of mysteries in that way. Why would this not be akin to wizardry? Right? To wizardry, to mastery, to magic itself, to alchemy, and the alchemy of the word. At the drop of a hat, at the drop of Rimbaud's magician hat, out spills all of these associations and doorways and pathways into which we can enter into a greater mystery in our own communion, in our own mystique with the mystery of language. And God, what did Shakespeare say to God? Shakespeare said, God, before you, I am here at last, and I see your face, like the face of the deep shining upon the waters. But, oh God, I have a wish I ain't never fulfilled. I've got a dream I ain't never dreamed, actually. I've got a masterpiece I have never created. And God said, be. In other words, God said to Shakespeare's utterance, be, O Shakespeare's utterance. And then Shakespeare uttered on. Shakespeare said, I got a wish I ain't never spoken out loud. And it is this, I, Shakespeare, who have created so many others again and again, and brought forth their very lives and the feeling of their experience, I have never felt like I was myself. Oh God, I wish that I, for once, could be Shakespeare and Shakespeare as himself, rather than everyone and no one, as I sometimes fear myself to be. And God said, ah, my dear Shakespeare, let me hold you to the stillness of my creative heart and tell you that you are like me. You created your works so that you, no one, could be everyone, in the same way that I, God, created the world so that I could know myself as everyone and no one. So you see, Shakespeare, I created the world in which you are like me, everyone and no one. So, like Rimbaud, Shakespeare goes on speaking to us through the tissues, of course, of the literary forms of the sonnets and the plays, but beyond that, even into the stories like these that we tell, out of what we've read, out of what we've heard, right? In the folk art, of spontaneous forays into poetic composition, which is what Rimbaud is inspiring in us these days. If you want me to tell you, and the telling is the welling forth, right? So, but here's Rimbaud at a very young age, so that prodigal nature is still there to fascinate us. But at a very young age, he's setting the stage for how he will be appreciated conventionally and also appreciated contemporarily, as in like right now, because there's ever so much that we can calibrate and reach into the nuances of and tune. Rimbaud's utterances are there for us to attune, and we attune them by attuning ourselves to them. It's not quite translation, but you don't need to know the specific language to relate to it, right? And this is a way. But Rimbaud writes, and this is in a letter to a teacher of his, I think, Isambard, or maybe his friend, to Paul Demeny, and a teacher or a friend or both. Part of his learning community. He did have a learning community. He was a precocious and prize-winning student, a breveted adult, if you ask me, probably got too much too fast of a notion of his own charisma, and at a young age when everything else was impinging on him. And so that comes in so fast, and then it goes inside you. And then when it comes out again, as you forge for yourself your adult identity in the culture that you are in, that's when you're beset by all these random and wayward energies, that come to you in the course of your warped development. This is universal, and yet it's highly specific to Rimbaud and his problems. But more on that later or less on that later. Who knows where the spirit will lead? But here's what he writes to a friend, a spiritual friend, Paul Demeny. But anyway, he says, prose on the future of poetry. Prose on the future of poetry. All ancient poetry culminated with Greek poetry, harmonious life. From Greece to the Romantic movement, the Middle Ages, there are writers and versifiers. From Ennius to Theorilus, from Theorilus to Casimir de la Vigne, it's all rhymed prose. A game, the sloppiness and glory of innumerable ridiculous generations. Racine is the standout, pure, strong, great. Had his rhymes been ruined and his hemstitches muddled, the divine dunderhead would be as forgotten today as the next author of the Origins. After Racine, the game got old. It kept going for 2,000 years. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will see what we can find in it when I read further. Reason fills me with more certainty about all this than young France would have been with fury. So the neophytes are free to curse their forebearers. Here's the Declaration of Independence, so to speak. It's very French, but it's also very manifesto-like. The neophytes are free to curse their forebearers. It's their party, and the night is young. Ah, the wit. It's their party, and the night is young. So make your manifesto. Romanticism has never been fully appraised. Who would have? Critics, the romantics who so clearly prove that the song is infrequently the work of a singer, which is to say, rarely is its thought both sung and understood by its singer. Let that be a little doorway in our Advent calendar. Rarely is the song understood by the singer. Now, when I hear that, I wonder, is this the problem of a singer singing a song written by another? Is this what that is? But then he kind of specifies it further, because these are tuned ideas. The process of reasoning is a tuning. That's what throws us off about the poetic reasoning of one such as Rimbaud, who is very precise, very harmonious, very Greek, and very clear. that whole process of reasoning is like an attuning. And so the next step in it is the singer and the song. Let me extrapolate a little bit. The singer and the song are made one in the singer's understanding of the song. Now, I've helped myself a little bit to what Rimbaud might be saying there, but I think that's the singer is at one with the song and the singer's understanding of the song. And so to me, I must tell you that this gives me permission to understand that poetry is a conceptual art. And it makes it possible then for vowels to transmute into colors, of course, and for the eye of the seer to see much more, but to see actually through the eye, not with the eye, as William Blake said. So I begin to become ever more and always in a new way, a new and fascinating way, ever more familiar with this deep and familiar notion, of this faculty of the imagination which is addressed and strengthened and made whole and gifted by poetry such as what Rimbaud writes, and by poetry such as and by poets such as who Rimbaud is. So the singer's understanding of the song. And then here we take a step into more familiar territory, because the very next sentence, at the start of the next paragraph in Rimbaud's letter, he writes, "For I is someone else. And I is another." And this is what Bob Dylan refers to more than once, I think, when he is relating the inspiration that Rimbaud has for him. Well, there's so many others, but this note, I is another. It is so universal, right? It is so original that we all understand it in our own way. That's what's original about it. It inspires originality because when we hear it, we know it's real because we are that. Because we too, I is another, And then we read in the Upanishads and are comforted with the counterpoint of that notion, which is, Svetakitu, thou art that. That's the complementary of I am not I, is when the sage in the Upanishads assures the student that Svetakitu, that, thou art that. When they, are understanding the world, or when we say now through the mystery of poetry that the singer and the song are made one in the singer's understanding of the song. But now Rimbaud, no matter what, in his understanding of his own creativeness, there's going to be severity, there's going to be harsh junctions. It's part of his daemon, part of his mystique, and part of his appeal. And so maybe we'll find more evidence of this, maybe not. Anyway, for I is someone else. If the brass awakes as horn, it can't be to blame. It's not its fault. That much is clear. I'm around for the hatching of my thought. I watch it. I listen to it. I release a stroke from the bow. The symphony makes its rumblings in the depths, or leaps fully formed onto the stage. See? And always, anyone understands this, the human faculty of intuition. We experience it, often. It's one of the reasons that we read poetry and study art and literature is to, we abide with it as our eyes move back and forth across the page, And we're doing more than looking at the pictures, of course. We are practicing a conceptual art. And then all at once, it's all there. The meaning of what we're reading about. The concept behind that which makes it memorable to us. The, reason of being in the center of the stillness of our quality of attention. Expressed in time, we call it the attention span. Expressed in space, in qualitative space, I at this moment would call it interest, having interest in something. And then there's this corollary movement, which is entheos, enthusiasm, to be filled with the God. And this is where the utterance and the expression come in. And clearly Rimbaud has felt the energy of this understanding in him to such a degree that the only outlet for it, the only way to make it manifest, the only way to deal with it is to make it manifest. Otherwise, it's utterly unknown within you, dominating you until, it's like a fish finding refuge in the water. A fish that's been out of the water returned to its original element, which is water, and swimming with more freedom than a bird has. I would think, I would imagine. So let me run back into Rimbaud for a minute and quote him directly a few sentences later, another paragraph perhaps. In Greece, as I mentioned, poems and lyres, the instrument that is, poems and lyres turned action into rhythm, and it's italicized. The instruments and the compositions in which the instruments are put to their purpose. This is action put into rhythm. And where else is action put into rhythm? Energies in the psyche that are there before we have words for them, which is part of our what we wrestle with as human beings, and what Rimbaud is wrestling with and giving us an example of through his life story in his own unique way. These wordless kind of energies. In words, they also find other aspects of their nature. Not only are they concepts, but they are artistic forms. And as artistic forms, they are having rhythm, they are having pattern, they are having texture, and of course they are having meaning. And sometimes it's perhaps clumsy to insist upon that in a certain way. And I think that I am doing that now because, I think learning from Rimbaud, I have kind of stepped back from it and understood him as a form from a certain distance. Why? Because I see the pain of being unable to, how would I say, manage the excess or the surplus of energy and how it might come out. And if you're not, part of moral being is trying to understand the relationship that one has with others. And so let me just tell you now. So for Rimbaud, I hope to have a glance of that, of Rimbaud in his relation of his understanding with others, in his human world, actually, in his intimate human world. This also becomes like conventionally speaking, there's the soap opera of Rimbaud's life and all of these fraught relationships and this acting out and this violence, and that's part of the mystique too. And it of course it is all there, but it also casts light on Rimbaud's creative contribution. And Rimbaud's creative contribution continues as he finds himself in other places, in other communities, in other contexts. And we find more to his character than is there in his legends as enfant terrible. Rimbaud, yes, he abandoned that, but Rimbaud did something else. Rimbaud continued on his path, and he matured, you might say, because he had to. And even at the same time, he remained the same person, but you just see the expressions of his character take place in a different form, which brings us to what I wanted to tell you. It takes place in action. Before, he's a poet of words. And then, seemingly, in a legendary sense, he becomes the man of action, the explorer, the gun runner, the mercantilist in the borderlands, the frontier jack of all trades. He becomes that. And I'm speaking of that because that too is like legendary, but also he moves in a certain kind of community, a community of strangers in a strange land. When Rimbaud goes to Africa, I'm telling you this, it's abrupt, and it's an abandonment, and it's everything that has always been said about it. But let us also understand, he's looking for kindred spirits, and he finds them because before he's a stranger in a familiar land, in provincial France, in cosmopolitan Paris, on the roads of Europe, in the inns and the hostels and the barns and by the sides of the roads. In a certain sense, he's a veteran, perhaps an actual veteran, though there's no official record that he ever enlisted or functioned or acted as a soldier, but he had been a witness in a certain sense, as all of Paris had at that time, to the Paris Commune. Yeah, about 1870 or so, and the fall of the Paris Commune. Rimbaud was running away from home and going back and forth between Paris and provincial Charleville, where he was from, and he witnessed a great deal of that in his own way, and it fed into the poems that he was writing that were oh so incandescent, as well as all the inner visionary kind of stuff. And so this is why he's fascinating. All this is happening in Rimbaud. But then ideas, actions into rhythm. A poem is one way to turn action into rhythm. He knows this. He's written about it. He discovered it when he was a poet. And then there are other ways of turning action into rhythm, and that is by your peregrinations. He was realizing that first. He was the disciple of Hermes, let me tell you, because as Verlaine described him, as the man with the wind at his heels, or the one with shoes of wind, he was peripatetic and restless and footloose, as you might say, and had all kinds of experiences describable in all kinds of colorful ways. And then there, of course, too, there's many and many a story, and anecdotal and often repeated, that is not true, could not possibly be true. But eventually he's learning how to work for a living in all these borderland situations, these marginal situations that he seeks out, and there are plenty all around. He finds them at the edges of continental Europe, and at the jumping off points for excursions into the unknown worlds, right, into the colonies. And people go there for all kinds of reasons. It's like the Old West in a certain sense. Maybe many go to find gold, to seek their fortune, and others are looking for spiritual gold, and the seekers and all this. And so it's romantic. He was pretty hard-nosed and pretty ruthless, I have to say. But he was still doing that then, turning ideas into action. Poets, like we see not with but through the eye, when we are seers, when we are poets, we speak not with but through language. Oh yes, language is the door, and language opens the door, and there's locks and there's keys, and there's lore about locks and keys, but we turn the door, we go through the doorway, but the poem still goes on. The door is language, the threshold is language, the entryway is language, but the poem is beckoning us on. We might not know that, though, because without poetry, how can we know anything? So Rimbaud was drastic enough, severe enough, courageous enough, reckless enough, very patient in enduring hardship, less patient with certain human interactions. Right? And we can objectively say that, right? But then when he leaves, when he becomes another, I is another, becoming someone else. You could describe Rimbaud as becoming someone else is his central preoccupation. And you could say that's the key to the door of his character, becoming someone else. I will tell you, no, or yeah, but every step through a doorway is also a beginning. And a further beckoning onward, and then a different kind of door, and a different kind of doorway, or maybe no doorway at all. Maybe the doors are actually illusions or what have you. I don't know. But Rimbaud, patient in enduring suffering, right? As he said in his original letter, what if the seer loses the understanding of his visions and dissolves into, mute delirium? Well, the youthful Rimbaud, with great bravado, writes, what of it? What of it? At least he has seen them, says Rimbaud, and convinces us. We're carried along in the song of his life with that expression of youthful bravado, because bravado is only the skinniest surface of something else. Recklessness and courage and abandonment and waywardness and, condemnation and the energy of being under condemnation, and which is to be ejected, from the doorway, you might say, from one kind of doorway, and then having to go and make your own, so to speak, out of the urge to make within you, which you may not have words for. And so, what a tangled web we weave, eh? But with Rimbaud, we see this when we learn the ways that it can act it out. We can act it out. We can act it out without being, we can tend that fire without being burnt by it. Adolescents will put their fingers in the fire in order to know that they are having an experience of something that is fire. Why do they do this? Because they haven't learned the attention to just perceive, to witness, to abide with, it's easy for us to learn how to observe and amass facts and notations, and truly that's a beautiful way and necessary way to practice the arts of language. But there is also the silent looking, where this is the creative way to be someone else. As Walt Whitman, another seer, in the same domain, says, there was a child went forth, and everything that this child saw, that child became. He talks about that. Whitman also said, I contain multitudes. Whitman wrote the song of myself. He said, I celebrate myself, I sing myself. And what does he say? I am what you are. What I become, you become. So there it is. Rimbaud says, I am another, and he puts us into the territory with all these calls and responses from all these timeless voices, the voices who utter the masterpieces of literature, you see. And so this is where Rimbaud brings us, I was going to read you something, and it is this. And maybe we can maybe I can point myself in another direction. But first this, Rimbaud still writing in this letter. The universal intelligence has, of course, always shed ideas. Man harvests a portion of these mental fruits. They measured themselves against them, wrote books about them, so songs progressed. Man not working to develop himself, not yet awake, nor not yet enveloped in the fullness of the dream. Not yet enveloped in the fullness of the dream. And at the same time, he's talking also about being awake, but not yet, right? Not yet. These mental fruits, harvesting a portion of the mental fruits. This is true. And Rimbaud was saying this at, 17 or something. At 17, he learned the truth. So things progressed. Oh, functionaries, but I'm not sure if he's using the word in a negative sense. Functionaries, writers, author, creator, poet. Such a man never existed before. And what does he mean by that? Is he talking about the course of history? I must put this down. Yeah, sure. He's talking about the course of history. But he's also talking about the coming forth from within him, you see. Because when he's talking about the universal intelligence, to me, that means that he's creating from out of himself. He's discovered this infinite depth within himself, and he's beginning to learn the algebra of it. Yes. And also the alchemy of it. Yes. He's beginning to learn that because he's seeing the reflection in action and in rhythm of the movements of his imagination, the movements of his learning, of his skill in learning the arts of language, and the transmutations and changes and metamorphoses of the universe all around him, and, the rampaging and jagged and challenging feelings that are both within him and in his emotions bursting out of him, and in the rampaging of this instinctual madness that could not be caged. And along with that, I mentioned the Paris Commune and the suppression of the Paris Commune and that was a violent time. July of 1871, I think. Rimbaud happened to have gone back to Charleville in May. He wasn't there for that, but he knew a lot of those people. Verlaine was actually a communications commissar or something for the Paris Commune, but he was in another part. He escaped the danger too. And all these repercussions, I won't go into all that because it's tremendous. But even before that, near where he lived in the Ardennes, it was the Franco-Prussian War, which was, the prelude to the Paris Commune. Yes, in terms of chronology. During the time of the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, it made the circumstances for the Paris Commune to have its short-lived incandescent existence. So these are explosive times experienced by someone with an explosive gift exploding out of him, and yet at hand, fortunate for us and for all time and for himself, he has this gift for language art and for literary expression. And he can't help it, but there it is, and it's feeding into his conception of himself and his conception of the world, and he's going to act on it because he is possessed by the God, and so that's why we talk about him in this way. But there's always more to a literary character than being possessed by the God. But let's just mention also something that we have to mention. Yes, how does he write his works, which we are reading now, in the recollection of our understanding of having learned and pondered and contemplated the rich course of his life and all the different contexts he lived that life. And no matter what, there's a literary meaning or a literary expression there for us, because that's how it is speaking to us. It is speaking to us. And that's the very essence of why we continue to find the creativeness in the works. And so how do we become students, you might say? Well, we look at the travels, as I mentioned. We look at the things that he did. We look at his character amidst it all. But let's look at some of the geography of it maybe too. Eventually, well, I might have to encapsulize it. But eventually, yes, of course. He writes A Season in Hell. It is said he burnt some of the manuscripts, but I think that may not be true. I think that there were many people around him who were contributors to his legendary way of seeing himself and who saw him in that legendary way. And in their recollections of him, they were the beginning of the mystique, the recollections of those who knew him. And they were close to him in literary terms, in erotic terms, in familial terms. And then later on, they were strangers in a strange land together. That's why I tell you, when he went to Africa and became that was the fulfillment of these legendary relationships, in the sense that together he would find his kindred spirits. He would be a stranger in a strange land. Where in Europe, where he wrote that poetry, he was a stranger in a land which wasn't strange to him. Or it wasn't the canvas that he needed to live his life. It certainly was the canvas that he needed to paint his artworks with words and ink and pen. But to live his life, he needed roads, he needed the world, he needed strange lands. And so, he enlisted in the Foreign Legion, actually the Dutch Foreign Legion, and went all the way to Java and then deserted. This was after he wrote Season in Hell, after he did and did not burn the manuscripts, or a good portion of them, after, Rimbaud, they quarreled, acting out in their, violent tantrums and in the pointless intensity of the endless negative climaxes of their acting out. The relationship, he was shot in the wrist, and not wounded badly, but feverish and in the midst of all this stuff. And then he said farewell to poetry. He said farewell to bohemian life in Paris. He said farewell to all those that who had loved him and recognized his talent above all, and read his poems and midwifed them or shepherded them into publication and all. And he turned away from that with souls of wind, and then he took to the roads, as I was saying. And so he finds himself in the Suez Canal, and going through the Suez Canal. Oh yes, and down the Suez into the Red Sea, the scene of so much of the rest of the tableau, the backdrop of so much of the rest of his life down the Red Sea and through all the way to Java. There he is with them in Java, the Dutch colonial army, which is kind of the equivalent of the Foreign Legion, and which does have that mystique of these lost souls, joining up. Anyway, he deserts. He deserts into the jungles of Java. Nothing is written down about this. Nothing is written down about so many of this kind of thing. And yet here we are talking about it and seeing it in our minds. Why do we see it in our minds? Well, I'll tell you why. When he deserted, he vanished into the jungle, and he left behind his things, his gear, his soldier stuff. And then his unit, where did whoever he was go? I don't know, the wind blew and he was gone. Oh, he must have become someone else. But they had his gear. We got his gear. What are we going to do with it? We'll donate it. Let's donate it to the orphanage. So there was an orphanage in Java that got the fruits of what Rimbaud left behind when he turned away. This is a metaphor, actually. An example, too, and maybe perhaps a further example of the specific characterological poetics, of his moral being, that we who receive the riches of his abandonment of literature receive the riches of that because the legend is increased. And what is a legend? What is a myth but something that evokes from us a creative understanding, and those, in so doing, strengthens the creative well springs of humanity. Well, this is what Rimbaud's abandonment did in the area of poetry. When Rimbaud abandoned the Dutch colonial army, he left behind these things that were the proceeds of their auctioning or their selling was donated to this orphanage. Let me jump ahead and say that again and again, all through Ethiopia and Aden, Somalia, and Shoa, and on both sides of the Red Sea, in Cairo, in Alexandria, in I don't know about in Cyprus. Something bad happened in Cyprus. He worked there twice. He was the foreman of a quarry, and another time he was higher up at a higher elevation in the forest. I don't know if they were chopping down trees or something to build another governor's mansion or something. Something really bad happened. It is said, he just said there were unpleasant circumstances, but he certainly left early. But something bad happened. An Italian trader in Harar, I guess, or maybe Aden. A lot of the expatriates and traders and borderland Europeans, Italians, Germans, Greeks, Armenians, French, British, and all the various local groupings and peoples and tribes and principalities and dominions and nascent city-states and nascent nations. All these were affecting and contributing to the way that the trade of the commerce and the human intercourse was being conducted. And an Italian trader was friends with him, and according to him, in later recollection, which is another thing, yes, the people who knew him in Africa, they recollect him later on. They knew him and they didn't know he was famous, mostly. And then later on, when they're old, they find out about this was Rimbaud. Rimbaud. Did you know him? Yes, I knew him. Oh, that was Rimbaud. Well, let me tell you about him. And then they have certain specific recollections which give us a clearer and further picture of his character. So it is in the memories of people that are the pages in which his poems are written, you might say. And then it's written down into the book of life. And then we read it in whatever book of life that is manifesting itself to us in our hands at that time. And this is how it goes on, you see, in this recollection of a life. This is the nature and the beauty of such a mythic life, And that's just how it is. But anyway, well, yeah, something bad did happen in Cyprus. They say, according to this trader, Rimbaud threw a rock, and it hit a worker in the temple, and the worker died. It doesn't say that Rimbaud threw the rock at the worker or anything like this, And Rimbaud himself never said this. And there are letters in the back and forth, and he refers to leaving. And just like he refers to leaving a million other things, Oh, he made it back from the jungles of Java under an alias. if I remember it, I'll tell you the alias, with a Scottish boat, and he made it back all the way to Ireland, and then he made it all that he was back in Charlottesville by Christmas, which was the pattern. He would do these things, and he would be back at home and spend the winter there, and sometimes sick in all these various ways, until he doesn't enter the gate into Harar in Ethiopia until 1880. December, November maybe of 1881, when he first steps off of the dhow. He's in Aden, and he's there for a long time. This is the jumping off point for the different kind of French traders. These are the contacts where he finds his contacts, and then he wants to get out of there. I don't remember some number of years or months he's been there. He wants to get to the coffee lands, he wants to get to the plateaus and the deserts. We could go on and on in the landscape descriptions, in the dream images of, the season in hell, the illuminations and all that. We could go on and on finding visionary descriptions, poetic descriptions of these landscapes arising in the spontaneous spectacle of Rimbaud's visionary poetry. And we could spend all day, probably, looking at ways that he would have seen things like that in the real world, for him to either be enchanted by or disenchanted by. Remember, enchantment and disenchantment are the right and left hand of youth and age, of maturation and of poetic composition. And so this too, is a further and proportionate and exact step, into the unfolding of the mythic thematicness of the riches of this kind of life, or this kind of symbolical kind of energy, that is so uncanny, which is the genius of Rimbaud. And anyway, so he makes it there up to Harar. He's probably the third Frenchman to ever be in Harar. For a long time, from prehistoric times, no doubt. There are certain places. And then for a long time, it was an emirate, under the protection of successions of Arab emirs. And non-Muslims, foreigners, were not allowed in Harar. They were in other cities, in other emirates, of course. But certain cities, it was that way. There's Mecca, Medina, Cairo, Harar, Jerusalem. Some of these are special cities, in the world of the monotheistic religions. And but Richard Burton, speaking of a different kind of literary character than Rimbaud or Whitman or William Blake or Shakespeare, or God, of these others I've mentioned, Richard Burton, the trickster, the literary sleight of hand artist and master of disguise, disguised himself as a Muslim merchant and was actually in Harar in 1855 or so. And he had, mellow and entertaining descriptions of it. And he was quite a character indeed, but he had to disguise himself to be there. Eventually, though, Egypt, as a nation state, exerted more influence there, and the city did become opened up to foreigners. And so Armenians and Greeks and Turks and Italians and then the various highland tribes and stuff. And then the French, the first Frenchman, they say, was Bardi, Alfred Bardi, who was actually Rimbaud's relatively long-term employer in Abyssinia and in Shoa and in Aden as well. And of course, it's a traveling kind of job, sends him out on these expeditions. Indeed, Rimbaud was a certain kind of explorer and documented it in certain very brought out by necessity kind of literary compositions. But those too, you can read those and get a feeling for, this is Rimbaud also. And look at him now, he's still writing. And he never stopped writing. When they say he abandoned the role of the poet in which he became so distinguished and legendary, but he never wrote an uninteresting sentence After that, before that, during that, no. He wrote letters to his family, letters to employers, business kind of letters all the time, letters to geographical society. There's a few of those, and letters to the French ministry and other things with descriptions of landscape, of topography, of trade prospects, lists of requests, always that, and sometimes, and perhaps in a maniacal kind of way, sometimes he wanted to have like all kinds of scientific equipment. Other times he wanted language manuals, and sometimes he was able to get them from his mother, and sometimes he wasn't. And this always is a certain kind of frustration. So all the time there's this devouring voraciousness, for understanding and knowledge, okay? And which manifests as a stranger in a strange land. This is how it's going to be. And we can see it again and again. For example, it was in Harar. Rimbaud came in one gate, and he went out another of the walled gates, the gated walls of this city of Harar, this ancient city of Harar, now open to foreigners. He was the third Frenchman to be there. First was his employer, Alfred Barty, and then Barty's assistant, I don't know, I can't remember his name, Pinchard, some French kind of name, and then Rimbaud himself probably. But there was many other traders, cosmopolitan kind of place, and an ancient and archaic and arcane place. There's hyenas out there. There's it's an arcane city, the oldest city undoubtedly that had ever been in, and holy ground and a holy crossroads. This is the hermetic nature. He's been writing lines of his walking all through Europe. He's crossed the Alps on foot and wrote a very interesting letter about that, which is full of surreal descriptions, but you're not surreal descriptions. They're what he was actually going through in terms of the way you perceive your shadow when you're in a whiteout of a snowstorm, when every step that you take, you sink, to varying degrees of depth, and you dig yourself out in varying ways in ever deepening snow, and you guide yourself by the rows of the telephone poles. Sometimes you can see them and sometimes you can't. What kind of a calligraphy is that? And then he makes it overnight where the monks are. And he describes, these squalid sheds on top of the mountain on hard mattresses and with, I don't remember, thin gruel and stuff. And I think he describes the dogs, but they're not St. Bernards with barrels of whiskey, to feed the stranded travelers in the snow. They're like big old hounds or something. So there's the sardonic quality, but it's also utterly realistic writing. But it's Rimbaud, and we recognize it. We recognize it from what he wrote when he was a kid and dreaming his dreams. We see it now when he's crossing the Alps. And so, like I say, this patience with hardship and the ability to stay like a soldier, which his father was. His father was a soldier who translated the Quran and deserted the family when he was 6 years old. His father was a captain. His father was an officer in the French infantry. And he deserted the family and he translated the Quran. I don't know how much of the Quran he translated, but see, this is where Arthur got it. Arthur knew. I don't remember seeing anybody. I don't know if he was a polyglot. He spoke many languages, and he was more than one letter said he is the village elders come to his house and they discuss the Quran, and some of them say he told me when I was talking to him, how do you get along with all of these different peoples, and he said. I learn to see the world the way that they see the world. I bring them gifts. I offer them trade. That's why I am there. I am a trader. Where traders have always been traders, and they have always been strangers. I am a stranger in a strange land, making my way. I don't know if he said it exactly like this. You know what he actually did say, though? He said, if they think that you're a Muslim, let them think that. Conduct yourself in such a way that they will think that. You will relate to them in those ways, because that is how things are transacted here. Whether you are really one Islamic or not, or they are Islamic or not, it's not necessarily. It's that the customs and the intellectual contribution to civilization is different here than it is, in provincial France where I came from. That was a monotheistic religion too, but it didn't work for Rimbaud. Now he was in a different place, and he was able to understand the inner way of being through decorum. Let's think about that for a moment. Because ever since Castiglione, the Renaissance courtier, notions of decorum and courtly manners and things, these are poetic gestures. This is a code, like the Japanese tea ceremony, like samurai ceremonialism, or any number of things. Courtly decorum and manners of expression are manners of expression. And so ways to conduct oneself, bearing, acting. Rimbaud is somebody, people see things in him. I wanted to avoid using the word charisma. I may already have. In its conventional sense, Rimbaud was like that. I would actually say he was part of his theme in the studying of his life is there is volatile, his apparitional nature was of a volatile kind. He could appear in all these different kind of faceted ways and yet still be himself. But he was looking for an assured sense of that on the inside. On the outside, he was that many times over. But on the inside, he was still looking for that. You see, this is that notion, we're back to that notion again. But this is how it can manifest. And so he's very sensitive to these notions of decorum. So he knows how to conduct himself on the roads of the world. He's a child of Hermes. Hermes is a god of the roads, of the crossroads, of the traders, of the slanted language, of the language where you say something that has other meanings. Is it deceit? Well, I guess it could be, but it is also the kind of speech that is a threshold speech. Through speech such as this, it is the language of the doorway. We're back again at poetry, you see. It's a different kind of language, and now he's approaching it through action and rhythm. The action of what he does in space and the rhythm of what he does in time. And in time, in the arts of time, which include literature, he has given us this mysterious and living and pretty exact form, which is the ongoing legend of his life, which we are exploring now, looking for notions, of what constitutes true poetry. And we're finding out from someone who supposedly isn't doing poetry. And I guess he's not. He's just doing. Or you could say he's not doing, he's being. But who is he being? In his own mind, he is being someone else. No, he is becoming someone else. He's going through a threshold, and we can understand this, and we continue to understand this. Well, he left Showa to go south once on an expedition. He had to get permission from his employer to do these things. He told his family one thing, and then he did something else. In one letter, he told his family, I'm going soon. I can't stand it here in Harar. I'm going soon no matter what I'm going. My prospects, I'm really not sure. Things here are different. One must be patient. And this is where this is taxed to the utmost, because he's in a different realm of time where things are done according to a different rhythm of time. And part of his calibration is that he's got this urge to push, to move, to go, when he hasn't understood the in-between spaces where the caesura is and the rests are. So there's this impetuous, headlong quality. And so he is seeking a harmonious way of life. He mentions it in the seer letter. We don't as often perhaps pay attention to that, but he's talking about the laws of harmony and action and rhythm, and he's having a hard time when he's living as a trader in these foreign countries, in these hinterlands, in these frontier economies, where the customs, he's kind of got a handle on that, sort of, they decorum, but yet the authorities, the bureaucracy, the versions of the red tape, the ornate legal documents, the Byzantine recesses of legal practice and commerce, people do things like sue each other. There's debtors, there's creditors, and they're always trying to do certain things, and you don't really know what they're getting at, the trickery and all this stuff. And so in a certain way, he's put to the test with this kind of really severe and abrupt, brusque, sardonic kind of temperament. He's not always a nice guy, man. And so, but he's put to the test. He tells his family, I'm leaving here. I'm going to traffic in the unknown. But he gets permission from his boss to go on a pretty long expedition, but it's 30 miles south, and it would take about 10 days. And he asked permission. There's a group of peoples out there, some peoples out there who trade in skins, and the skins of goats and cows, but their resources are such, and they're so isolated, they can't make it to Harar, which is a trading crossroads, archaic as it is. I've got to go to them. I believe that there are prospects where we can make money there. And his boss says, I don't know if there's prospects or not, but go ahead and go and find out what you can find out. So he's kind of sent as an explorer, but within the parameters of finding, routes of commerce. And so he goes, but just before he goes, let me just tell you this, and I know. He goes through the doorway of another gate of Harar, on horseback with a caravan on this thing. And just before he goes, he takes a cloth from somewhere and he wraps it around his head, and then he pulls a blanket out from behind, his bags on the back of his horse, and he wraps a red blanket around himself, and then he rides away. His friends laugh, and he laughs too, because he's in a good mood. But you see what he's doing? He's on a pragmatic level. He is. And he's not trying to trick anybody, because people will know by the way he speaks and by the way he looks. But he's dressed in the garb of one who is traveling, conducting business, and who understands the customs. He's dressed in the garb of a noble, businessman with ceremonial aplomb. And they laugh and he laughs, and he wouldn't have, back in France, he would have been more of a jerk probably. I don't know, but he has a sense of humor about it, but he's doing that, and he's doing that for a reason. And to get along, to pass through the checkpoints like a hermetic one does, but also he's becoming someone else. So I know that the time is such. I can look at my watch, and I don't want to go on too much longer, but I just want to tell you of another connection. Rimbaud, the gun runner. There was a big market for guns. Why? Well, so many reasons. But there was a nascent nation state of Ethiopia, and there were these dominions and ornate, and these lines of succession from archaic times, down which kings become kings and queens become kings. And there's Solomon and Sheba, and their child came to this place. And there is two lines of succession, a male and a female line of descent. And these become, the royal houses of Showa and of Abyssinia. And but because of everything else that is happening, there's also notions of statehood and modernization and all of this, and designs of cultures and cities that are arising from the minds of these archaic kings. I'm talking about King Menelik II, who eventually, when Rimbaud wasn't exactly there, but took over Harar, because the emir there had closed it off to foreigners again. And Menelik, he wasn't emperor yet, but he was the king of Showa, and he was consolidating his powers, and he was realizing the important nature of some of these crossroads. At the same time, realizing that once he began to build railways and things, because that was part of the vision of this ancient king, many of these old trading routes would be bypassed. Nevertheless, he needed them. And there were all these networks of kinship and aristocratic title. And his cousin was a general, and by sheer force of numbers, not by Rimbaud's guns, because he didn't sell them to King Menelik yet, only because of that. There were plenty of guns, though. And when Rimbaud did bring some guns to Emperor Menelik had just taken Showa, and I don't remember if he'd actually become the actual coronated, throne holder, but he was fresh after many victories and abiding in his capital, which wasn't where Rimbaud thought it was necessarily. And Rimbaud, on his way there, was beset by strange creditors of a business partner that he had this relationship with, but suddenly it had these consequences in these hinterlands, and he was becoming, very angry and acting out sometimes. But when he finally gets to the court of King Menelik and he presents him the guns, Menelik takes them, but he's already taken Harar. And he gives Rimbaud, a fifth of what Rimbaud was hoping to get, So the experience is there, but there's that aspect of it. Commercially, it's not that. But what it is, it's what I'm telling you now. Menelik established a relationship through a Swiss engineer who was Menelik's interpreter, I think, or business go-between with Rimbaud. And that became actually a friend of Rimbaud's later on in Africa. And this is where Rimbaud meets, well, as I mentioned, King Menelik's cousin was the general that enabled him to take over Harar, mainly by sheer force of numbers. It was 30,000 against 3,000. And it was a rout, in the big battle 40 miles west of Harar, but Harar itself was not sacked. It wasn't mutilated or, none of that. It was taken over peacefully. And after a symbolic gesture where he, I don't want to tell you what Menelik did, but he did something to profane the local shrine, a symbolic gesture. But then he handed the kingdom over to the cousin of the previous emir. So this is a kind of an Alexander the Great did these kind of things where you assert your sovereignty over it on the level of some kind of a sovereign kind of way. And sometimes it's religious and sometimes it's not, but I don't know, it makes a great story. It's vulgar somehow to tell about this aspect of it. But at any rate, when he was back after this conquest, that's when Rimbaud met him. Rimbaud had been in Harar and would go back to Harar, but here anyway, they had business transactions together, and which Rimbaud spoke of in a colorful and bitter way at times, but always within a Rimbaud kind of way, so much so that it's his account that he wrote in a letter to the French minister that we have this story. But anyway, the cousin was the general named Ras Mekonnen, I think is how you might pronounce it, Ras Mekonnen. And Ras Mekonnen was the potentate there, the representative of the emperor there. And Ras Mekonnen had a son. Ras Mekonnen had a son named Tafari. This was Ras Tafari. This is where Haile Selassie was born. And Haile Selassie was in the female line of descent from Solomon and Sheba. And eventually, Menelik did become emperor of Ethiopia, and the lines of success. And he repelled the Italians in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, and he sent them packing. And he consolidated the reign. He built the railway. He made Harar, an obsolete crossroads, but it's still an arcane and remote city, and where you can go and find the footsteps of Rimbaud, the one with the wind at his heels, and his cousin's son was Haile Selassie. They were shared parallel lines of descent from Solomon and Sheba, and so Rimbaud is there when we know this, and so I cannot go on and on like I would love to, but we have gone into a notion of I as another. We have gone into the notion of the one who becomes himself by going. We have the notion of the everyone and the no one, which we are. Thou art that, I is another, I contain multitudes, I celebrate myself, I sing myself, what I shall assume, you shall assume. And let us quote Walt Whitman then, and then we'll be on our way. But in Walt Whitman, for Rimbaud it was the fiery sun. For Whitman it was everything, everything and nothing. But when in the poem The Sleepers, which is a proto-surrealist poem, like Rimbaud wrote proto-surrealist poems. There's a line in The Sleepers, I dream the dream of all. I dream the dream of all. In their dreams I become the dream of all. Something like that, the nocturnal kind of corollary, the lunar corollary of something that we're trying to get at, where we are everyone and no one. And there are so many words for self. There are so many words for soul. There are so many words for the qualities of all of these things. And when we touch the mystery of the character of Rimbaud, we touch the mystery of the art of Rimbaud, where we come upon the truth that all words and all thoughts and all ideas are simultaneously giving birth all the time. And with that, I thank you for your heroic listening, because I know you have abided with me, and I hope it is worth your while. Thank you, and so long for now.